Thank you, Member. Oak Bay, Gordon Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise to take my place in the debates at second reading for Bill 20, the Insurance Vehicle Amendment Act. I thank the member from Richmond-Steveston for his comments and the Minister for introducing this bill. Bill 20 is one of two bills, Honourable Speaker. As you know, we've been debating Bill 22, the Civil Resolution Tribunal Amendment Act, and collectively these bills are designed to get a handle on the price increases that are going forward in ICBC. You know, British Columbia is the last jurisdiction in Canada, Honourable Speaker, for which victims can sue for any type of industry, for injury for any amount. This is known as the full tort system. And these measures are attempts to get a handle of costs. After quite a number of years, in the words of the Attorney General in a press scrum, he noted that ICBC finances became a dumpster fire. And I think actually that's quite appropriate in light of the comment in light of the rather dramatic rate increases and budget overruns that are seen in ICBC due to financial negligence of its oversight through to many years of a government that seemed to view it as a bank account from which to withdraw money rather than actually as an insurance agency in public good designed specifically to actually ensure value for British Columbians and safety for British Columbians on the road. Honourable Speaker, this bill provides for regulation on a few major aspects of ICBC product reform, including limiting payouts for pain and suffering for minor injuries and allowing for increased medical benefits to be established in regulation. And these announcements that are put forward in this bill were actually pre-announced in February. For me, the important aspect of this bill is what it does is it takes the onus off the legal system and puts the onus on getting a person healthy by increasing the availability of resources for them, whether they be expended service, but the treatment is the whole focus now is on the person. And that to me is important. It's that we all know of examples of litigative examples that one could describe as somewhat dodgy, and there seems to have been an increased growing number of these whereby people go to courts and sue for every this, that, and the other. And now with this being put in place, it's actually saying, you know what, we're joining the rest of Canada. We no longer are going to be considered the Wild West here in terms of the insurance premiums, but we're going to follow the lead of every other jurisdiction in Canada and move away from the full tort system to one that actually recognizes that costs in ICBC are going up and a substantial amount of those are associated with soft tissue industry injuries, and we will actually take steps to limit that. So there are a number of key changes in this bill. The most important one, as I outlined, is the focus on people and getting better rather than litigation. And that, to me, is a critical reason why I support this. Before I go on to the changes in the bill, I'd like to summarize again some quick facts from ICBC to underscore just how serious the situation is in ICBC, which is ultimately reflected in the ever-increasing, despite having no accidents, premiums that we are paying in this province. Government had to do something. ICBC claims totaled $2.7 billion in 2016, which was an 80% increase in 7 years. 7 years where the BC Liberals historically just watched and let this get out of hand. The average claim, Honourable Speaker, paid out for minor injuries rose from 8,200 in the year 2000 to 30,038 in 2016, a 265% increase in average claim payout for minor injuries, again, under the watch of the BC Liberals who let this get out of hand and viewed ICBC as a bank account from which to withdraw money, as dividends that should not have been withdrawn because the money didn't exist. You know, over this time, if I go back to the average pain and suffering award paid out for minor injuries, in 2000 it was $5,004. 2016 it was $16,499. Vehicle damage costs have increased 30% in just 2 years to a total of $1.5 billion alone in 2016. Now, I don't want causation a correlation to imply causation, but of course one has to wonder what the effects of eliminating those ICBC inspection stations and adjusters from actually assessing claims. What has been the net cost to the ratepayer, the ICBC ratepayer? Again, as a direct cost of measures that were taken by the previous government a number of years back. To the specific aspects of this bill, some of the key changes, Honourable Speaker, are that provisions are now being introduced through regulation to allow the claimant to recover damages for pain and suffering from minor injuries. There's now a legal definition of minor injury, which is included in this. Of course, and I have some sympathy for the comments from the member of Richmond-Steveston and the member from Vancouver-Langara in other debates that he's done here, that there's a lot of this is left to regulation. And again, there is some definition, there's some language with respect to minor injury and listing abrasions, contusions, lacerations, sprain and strains, pain syndrome, psychological and psychiatric conditions, or the old injury as prescribed in a prescribed class of injury, where that means whatever the regulation says, even if it's chronic. And I have some sympathy for the counter-argument raised by the Attorney General, who has suggested that in jurisdictions that have introduced legislation with respect to minor injuries, there's some very sharp lawyers out there who find exemptions to that. So rather than set it all in stone, the enabling legislation enables through order in council government to fix any loopholes that may arise in terms of people trying to claim something's not a minor injury when in fact the intent of this legislation would be that it were to be included. So again, I have some sympathy there. One of the things that's important is the allowance for an extended list of healthcare providers to allow ICBC to use for accident claims, which is actually important. And despite what the member said from Richmond-Steveston, there's a lot of people who aren't covered, and it's not easy to actually get coverage at all times with ICBC. And there are limits. And the focus now is not on recovery. The focus now is on trying to avoid the courts. And that's a problem. That's a problem when ICBC is more concerned about avoidance of courts and settling. And litigation in certain cases is more concerned about the settlement than actually getting someone better. I do have sympathy for the Attorney General in bringing this forward, this legislation, and support his efforts in this regard. There's a number of questions. I mean, of course, there's some mechanisms that are in this bill that allow ICBC to no longer reimburse other insurance companies, with the exception, of course, WorkSafe BC and the MSP, for payments to their customers. And of course, we know that today's customers can receive benefits from other insurance companies, not only ICBC, if they happen to have secondary coverage through work or others, and they can get that after a crash, but they may receive wage loss benefits, for example, or extended health care benefits from their employer. We know right now that most insurance company agreements, most insurance companies indeed have agreements in place where the customer has to pay back these benefits if ICBC also pays for these expenses. With the changes in the legislation, ICBC will not pay the other insurance company for the same benefit they have already provided. And that seems to me fair. If you've got the additional coverage, we're saying if you've got the coverage, ICBC isn't going to pay the insurance company. They're going to let the insurance company pay that additional amount. They'll still, of course, cover you if you're not covered. Of course, there are some overarching issues here. A lot of it's left to regulation, but overall, public response, with the notable exception of trial lawyers, is quite positive. I'll start with the negative, of course. We know that John Rice from the Trial Lawyers Association of British Columbia has suggested that the changes since February are concerning because they have widened what is considered a minor injury and therefore subject to the cap. And he says, the legislation represents, and I quote, one of the most significant attacks on legal rights of British Columbians in our province's history. The proposed legislation goes much further than what was previously announced by EB in February in making victims pay for reckless and distracted drivers. He says, instead, ICBC and the NDP...
Only referencing by riding name.
Oh, I do apologize. I was reading a direct quote from the letter. Thank you for noting that. Announced by the Attorney General, who he referred to by name, which of course is not appropriate for me to do so in this legislation. And he said, by the Attorney General in February in making victims pay for reckless and distracted drivers. Instead, he says, ICBC and the NDP government want to cap even more injuries than British Columbians suffer because of someone else's negligence. Now, my retort to John Rice, of course, would be that now British Columbia is the only jurisdiction in Canada, the only one left that is the Wild West of thou shalt sue whoever thou wants whenever there's an accident, see how much money you can get. I understand that there are certain trial lawyers who will be upset because they have made a livelihood out of this so-called issue. I also have some sympathy with respect to government trying to deal with this because costs are getting out of hand, and we know that those costs are coming for settlements on soft tissue, for example, and there's other costs associated with increased motor vehicle claims. But again, to members here, that it seems to me that we are the last jurisdiction for allowing this full tort system. It's not unexpected, nor is it really, frankly, outrageous, nor is it actually uncommon for one to expect that it's time for us to get with the program. And so I commend the Attorney General for actually stepping up and doing this. There are, of course, many other comments that are on the positive side. And I received many emails to this regard. A couple of key ones, of course, are Giovanna Boniface from the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, who says, and I quote, "Unbelievably, accidents benefits haven't been increased since 1991. BC occupational therapists have been helping injured drivers return to activities of daily living for decades and have seen declines in access to vital and necessary treatment for years. By raising the amount covered and expanding the variety of treatments that are eligible, these changes will allow more people to have access to the treatment and adaptive equipment they need, thereby fostering quicker recovery and return to meaningful daily activities." This is important, Honourable Speaker, because I know only too well problems that have arisen with people trying to get benefits from ICBC. You're allowed to make two claims, Honourable Speaker. In the first claim, they'll pay your expenses, but they won't pay your other medical expenses until the second one, which is when all is better. The problem there, Honourable Speaker, is ICBC is incentivizing you to go to a lawyer, because if you have a difficult time paying those expenses, and I know people very close to me who have had to pay thousands of dollars in expenses, they're not going to see lawyers because they want to actually get better, but they have to pay it up front. They can pay it up front. But what about the person who can't pay it up front? The person who doesn't have the hundreds and hundreds of dollars that to spend on ongoing physiotherapy. So make their claim after a couple of months and realize that they need months and many months more of physiotherapy and say chiropractor and massage therapy. They have to pay it and hope, or perhaps they'll get reimbursed at the end. But sometimes they can't, so they go to a lawyer. And a lawyer's office say, you know what, get yourself better, we'll cover the expenses, we'll open a file. And as soon as the lawyer opens the file, guess what? We know the settlement's going through the roof. So here, what is so good, what is so, so welcome to me in this bill, is that the focus is on the patient and getting the patient better. That is the number one focus. And for many, having the ability to get better is what they want. So again, I applaud government for bringing this forward. Another commentator is, of course, Jane Dyson from Disability Alliance BC. And Jane says, Disability Alliance BC has been advocating for improvements to accident benefits for 12 years. Funny that, 12 years? That's less than 16 years. The doubling of the overall allowance for medical care and recovery is a significant improvement. We welcome these long overdue changes that will mean that people who are catastrophically injured in motor vehicle accidents have better supports available to them to help them rebuild their lives. Moving forward, DABC, that's the Disability Alliance BC, looks forward to continued dialogue with ICBC and government to help ensure that British Columbians accessing accident benefits receive the treatment and financial support they need. And then, of course, there's Louise Craig, who's a Vancouver-based physiotherapist, who says this. She's also a spokesperson for Group Rights Over Arbitrary Decisions, ROAD, interesting acronym, Rights Over Arbitrary Decisions for British Columbians. And she said this: "It's good that government keeps talking about increasing medical benefit for those involved in a crash, but the loose definition of minor injury in Monday's bill remains concerning. I think they are expanding it so that minor injuries encompass the vast majority of injuries that occur and make the exception, say, a fractured bone or spinal cord injury. I think, this is the concern raised by a number in this House over the previous bills we've discussed as well. And again, I accept at this stage the argument put forward by the Attorney General that, in fact, the definition is meant to be a little loose in that one is hoping to refine it through regulation as time moves on to ensure that minor injuries are actually captured as minor injuries and not to ensure that, in fact, there are loopholes that people can actually get away with. So get away and kind of avoid the tribunal process, for example, or the maximum coverage. So, Honourable Speaker, again, long overdue for reform with ICBC. I'm very pleased that government is stepping in to douse this so-called dumpster fire with some water to ensure that ratepayers are protected, because something had to be done, Honourable Speaker. We could have done one thing, a couple of things. We could have scrapped ICBC, thrown the baby out of the bathwater and gone with a full private insurance system, as some jurisdictions have done. We could have gone to a complete no-fault insurance system, as other jurisdictions have done. And I think what government has done here is stand back and say, you know what, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to ensure that we keep this jewel called ICBC, but we also want to ensure that we reform it in a way and a means that actually ensures that ratepayers are getting value for their investment in the ICBC auto insurance plan, and to ensure that we clamp down on false claims or those who are, in some sense, using the system for their financial advantage through claiming of injuries that are not actually as serious as would otherwise claim. So I'm a very strong supporter of this bill, and I thank the Minister for bringing it forward, recognizing, of course, that it won't be without some concern and controversy elsewhere. And I thank you for your attention, Honourable Speaker.